Hello, my name's Jenn Scott, and I'm a trustee of the Scottish Battlefield Trust. And my talk today is called They Were All Highland Men, the Jacobites of the northeast of Scotland in the 45. In the last Jacobite rising, the army of Charles Edward Stuart was often called by both sides a Highland army, and the men were therefore presented as barbarian Highland warriors, the two obviously going together. This tartan-clad, anachronistic, sword-wielding army, which is how the Jacobites were seen at the time and have pretty much been depicted ever since, is not really right. Research done more recently challenges this idea since it confirms what plodding through the list of officers also shows that a great deal of the Highland army was not Highland at all. Much of the active support, in fact, came from areas such as Perthshire, Aberdeenshire, and Murrayshire. It was actually this much more widespread support that made it difficult for government loyalists like the Duke of Argyll to raise a militia, since the government essentially distrusted all Scots and thought they were ready to support the Stuarts at the drop of a white cockaded hat. Certainly, by the time that the Jacobites went into England, a considerable proportion of the army were not Highland men, despite tartan-clad appearances. It's important to state that the number given in this quote of 5,000 is not really a definitive number. Charles Edward Stuart led an army of around this size into England, plus, of course, the people who are never counted, the women and servants, whose number has been estimated at around 2,000 people. There was another army being raised in the north at the same time. It is reasonable, therefore, to estimate an army of closer to around 10,000 men. This equates with the numbers who fought at Falkirk. The more than 140 men who can be identified as officers from the northeast, e.g., Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire, and Murrayshire, belonged predominantly to what might be called lowland regiments: Glenbucket's, John Roy Stewart's, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of Ogilvy's regiment, Grant's artillery, Lord Lewis Gordon's, and a few in the Ecosse Royale. There were two officers in Fraser's: Charles Fraser, the younger of Inveralchi, who was killed at Culloden, and Simon Fraser of Dalhapie, a captain. Most of these regiments were run along what might be described as conventional 18th century lines. Ogilvy's, for example, had a grenadier company. The Jacobite officers in the northeast came from a range of social backgrounds. There were only two lords, Balmerino and Sligo. There was also Sir Alexander Bannerman, 3rd of Elsric, who fled to Gothenburg after the rising. There were a good many of them who could probably be described as gentlemen, having a designation, for example, i.e., being of somewhere, may be taken as an indication that their contemporaries certainly would have expected them to be gentlemen and treated them as such. Many of the men fighting were related to each other through marriage. Edmund Burt observed in his book, Letters from the North, written in the 1730s, that the better sort here, almost all of them, are related to one another in some degree, either by consanguinity, marriage, or kinship. Glenbucket, for example, gave a commission in his regiment to both his son-in-law, George Forbes of Skellet, and his son John. His son, however, didn't serve for long. Lord Elcho suggests that his son was blind from drink and didn't stay for more than a week. Right, this slide in front of you now are the occupations where they were recorded of the officers that we know about. Obviously, this does not add up to the total number of men, but it does give you a fairly good idea of the sort of things that the people were doing. Clearly, farmer, for example, is a very broad term. There were obviously some who were definitely lairds, and others, like the one identified tenant farmer, who were not. Gentleman, as I've already said, was quite a difficult term to define. You could be poor and a gentleman if you were descended from the right people. Obviously, money helped, but it wasn't the sole identifier of whether or not you were considered to be a gentleman. I'm rather fond of the person who was described as an idler, and I think we've all been there at various times in our life. They did come from all sections of society, although, as I've previously indicated, there wasn't as much support amongst the aristocracy as there was in 1715. They did, however, have considerable support from the wealthy middle class. Several of the names on this list and an analysis of the men from Aberdeenshire and Banffshire shows large numbers of well-to-do merchants and tradesmen in the Jacobite army. Many of them were related, as I've already mentioned, through marriage or otherwise. However, there were also several sets of brothers. There were over 20 of the men out of 140-ish that were definitely Catholic, although that does include 5 priests, and others where it seems very likely that they were in fact Catholic. This is a much higher proportion than the population at large. Right, the student, where you can see in the list there are a couple of students. One of the students was Press. He was only 17. His name was Walter Mitchell, and he was studying at the University of Aberdeen, which he left to go and hide in Buchan with his parents, for fear of being taken. Pitsligo's men found him anyway and refused the 20 guineas offered by his mother to release him. Charles Gordon, who was the third son of Binhall, his father tried to pay Glen Bucket to keep him away. Glen Bucket is supposed to have said that he wanted men and not money, and damned him, which to my mind shows a lack of understanding of the things essential for any kind of campaign. But anyway, I guess you need money and men. He was, however, Gordon, that is, saved after the rising from the rope because he was a very young man. He did remain in prison and eventually joined in a rebellion in Newgate in 1747, but he was allowed back to Scotland the year after. James Duff of Hatton, who was also extremely young, was an ensign in Avoches in Lord Lewis Gordon's, and he deserted after the Battle of Inverurie, and his involvement with the Jacobites was pretty much hushed up. He was only 16, and this doesn't seem to have hurt him in his subsequent career, because he became the Sheriff Clerk of Banffshire in 1761 when he was only 32, a position he then held for the next 40 years, and he didn't in fact die until 1804, which surely makes him one of the last credible survivors of the Jacobite army. And in fact, one of his sons, he had an awful lot of children, one of his sons fought and died at Trafalgar, so that's an interesting kind of jump on to perhaps the subsequent generations of warfare there. John Burnet, who was the younger of Campfield, an artillery officer, went into exile in the Netherlands when he'd been pardoned and banished on the 21st of July 1748. He had actually been captured at Carlisle, and then he'd spent the next few years in Southwark. Alexander Leith of Coltheen, near Gartley, who was described as an aged and infirm man, was taken at Carlisle, and he unfortunately was executed along with other Jacobites on the 28th of November at Kennington Common in 1746. Although amongst the people taken at Carlisle, perhaps the most perplexing case in terms of where he had ended up, and indeed his job, is George Ramsay of Strathbogie, who was an ensign in Perth and a wheelwright, which is not really what you consider to be a gentleman's job, in civilian life. He was a Catholic, like many of the men from his area, but Ramsay was saved from transportation or death, not by perhaps youth or money, but because his case was pleaded by the Venetian ambassador, and I can find absolutely no direct connection between the two men, and no reason why the Venetian ambassador would specifically have been intervening on behalf of a wheelwright from Strathbogie. There were also men who ended up in prison elsewhere: Aberdeen, Perth, Brecon, and Montrose. Lawrence Leith, who was a captain in Avoca's, was imprisoned in Aberdeen. George Gordon of Auchenrangen surrendered and was apparently released under the general indemnity with 10 guineas to take him home. So you could see that the treatment of the men is actually quite different. William Sharp, who was the younger of Stony Hill and was again only 16, he was an ensign in Elco's lifeguard. He was captured and pardoned, probably due to his age, but he'd already escaped, and in later life he fought for the Portuguese. They poisoned the greatest part of the young gentry of those parts with principles that have since thoroughly disappeared, for as young men came to their estates non-juring meeting houses were instantly erected on their lands, and they themselves were almost to a man officers in the rebel army in 1745. Non-juring in this context means that the Episcopalian ministers or priests had refused to take an oath of loyalty to the Hanoverian regime, and at the time of union, which is just under 40 years before this, approximately 40% of the population of Aberdeenshire were Episcopalian, and in Angus and the Mearns it was at least a quarter. In contrast, it was only about 5% in Lothian and the borders. So the likelihood of people in the northeast being sympathetic to the Stuarts is actually a lot higher, simply because of religious persecution and inability to go to university and do certain jobs, which was the case if you were Episcopalian or Catholic. And it was felt very strongly that it was likely that Charles Edward Stuart might be prepared to be more open to people from all religions doing jobs rather than just those that were Church of Scotland. Um, so, this shared persecution and shared religion was a major factor in helping the Jacobite lairds in the northeast to bring out voluntarily a large number of their tenants. Although it was claimed at the time that two-thirds of the two towns of Aberdeen were well affected for the government, so in sympathy with the government at that point. But given the number of men who came out as officers for the Jacobites, this claim seems hopeful rather than anything else. And in fact, during the Jacobite army's march to Inverurie, they they were actually joined by quite a large number of countrymen as they went towards that. And this was despite the fact that on the 30th of October 1745, so just before this, General Wade had declared the king was prepared to grant his subjects, those who had been seduced by menaces and the threatenings of their chiefs and superiors, to take arms and enter into unnatural rebellion. They were, if they went home before the 12th day of November, and therefore became faithful to His Majesty and the government, they would be assured of clemency. So, in addition to the Episcopalians, and I think this is terribly well known now because of things like Outlander, there were obviously a fair number of Catholics in Scotland. However, the number of Catholics probably only about 30,000 at that point, or which makes it approximately 3% of the population. Clearly, it's always difficult being really accurate with population numbers pre census, and really reliable, but it's likely that that is a reasonably informed guess as to the numbers. So the majority of the Scottish Catholics lived in the northeast of Scotland and in the east and western Highlands. So if we look at the list of officers from the northeast, there are actually quite a high number of Catholics. Among them, the sons of Louis Farquharson, from Braemar, in whose house Jesuit priests based themselves for their mission in the area, the younger of Auchenhove, Patrick Dougard was a captain in Lord Lewis's Gordon's regiment. His brothers Alexander and Joseph were actually priests. His father also allowed Jesuit priests to base themselves in his house. Gregor Farquharson of Tombay, an ensign in Lord Lewis Gordon regiment, had attended the Scots College in Paris and subsequently ran a boarding school for Catholic gentlemen. And quite a large number of the people who fought in the 45, they or their sons had attended this boarding school. There were quite a lot of little secret Catholic schools scattered about the areas where the majority of the Catholics studied, because if you sent your Catholic son to a normal school, then obviously they weren't going to receive any instruction in their religion. And for many people, that was the absolute key thing. Now, Farquharson probably died in prison after the Rising. His son, called Cosmo, um, probably after the Duke of Gordon. So the younger of Tombay was also out in the 45, however, he escaped. Gregor Farquharson was not the only Jacobite officer from the northeast to have studied in the Scots colleges abroad, which had been set up after the Reformation to help provide priests for the Scottish Catholic mission. So the idea to reconvert the whole of Scotland, and also but they also educated young Scottish Catholic men, since they couldn't go to university in Scotland. The 1730s were actually a time of high registration at the colleges. There were also at least 5 Catholic priests with the army: Father John Farquharson and his brother, Father Charles. Although John Farquharson wasn't with the army for very long, but they were both imprisoned subsequent to the 45. Father Alexander Gordon of Glencat, who was definitely involved in the Rising. Father Gordon died in prison. The Farquharsons, as I said, were imprisoned on a prison hulk, Pamela, in Woolwich for quite a long time, eventually being released on the condition that they left the country, which they did, and they went off to France to be involved in the Scots College there. Lieutenant James Gordon of Birkenbush, who was wounded at a skirmish in Inverurie, he had been a Catholic priest, but he got married after the Rising. So I'm going to assume that the likelihood is he wasn't actively being a priest in the Rising. Reverend John Tyree from Clashmore, who was priest to Glenn Bucket's regiment, was also involved in raising men for the Rising. He escaped after Culloden, where he'd been wounded twice in the head. Father Alexander Gordon of Gairnside, who was a Jesuit, was taken at Culloden and actually died in prison. Crichton of Auchengool, who was another Catholic, although not a priest, a lieutenant in Lewis Gordon's regiment, escaped to France after the Rising. Now, there had been complaints that his father, um, 10 years before the Rising, had a priest constantly residing in his family who performs public worship there, and is all ceaseless in his endeavours to get people to convert to Catholicism. There was also an Episcopalian meeting house on his land. Another Catholic officer, James Gordon of Aberlour, a captain in Stony Woods, whose father had been described as a considerable papist, and I think we can therefore assume probably was one himself, especially since they had a monthly mass in their house. All 4 of the Mingies of Pitfodles had studied at the Scotch College in Regensburg, and their other 2 brothers also fought, so there were 6 of them out, but only 4 of them were officers. You wonder if that caused any kind of arguments at home. One of them was pardoned. The rest of his brothers escaped, in addition to all the men who can be picked out as Catholics, there was, quite intriguingly, one Quaker, Jonathan Forbes of Brucks, who is reported to have been extremely reluctant to leave the field at Culloden until he'd let daylight into two or three of these English devils. So, that does suggest that there are a lot of different people fighting for Charles Edward Stuart there. And in fact, the number of priests, there is also a non-jurant minister, John Maitland, who administered Holy Communion in oatmeal and whiskey to the dying Lord Strathallan. Right, this 1731 map shows the families in the northeast thought to be loyal to the Jacobite cause with the numbers of men that they were supposed to be able to command. However, this is really taken from the 1715 rising, and quite a lot of things had changed by 1745. Most crucially, despite everything I've just said about Episcopalianism being really quite strong and Catholicism being quite strong in the northeast, the Duke of Gordon, who was Catholic, had died in 1728, and his widow decided that her children, so the next Duke of Gordon, would be brought up as Episcopalian rather than Catholic. And so his protection, which is part of the reason there had been so many Catholics in that area, and to some degree Episcopalians as well, was weakened and removed at that point, although not entirely, because, for example, the Commission of the General Assembly, so people from the Church of Scotland, the official Protestant Church of Scotland at that point, had written to the Duchess of Gordon on the 16th of May 1734 to plead with her to give orders to suppress Catholic schools and seminaries in places where His Grace the Duke of York Gordon had jurisdiction. So, his traditional heartland. And they were specifically looking for Scanlan, which was a seminary for priests in Scotland, in Glenlivet, to be suppressed, because obviously, if you don't have the priests, it's much harder to carry on with the religion in many ways. Hence, those people that I've already mentioned who were prepared to let Jesuits base themselves there and would frequently have mass in their houses and so on. And the commissioners were also asking her to discourage mass and meeting houses, and to discourage public Catholic meetings within the Duke of Gordon's jurisdiction. So that now, clearly, if we look at the numbers of Catholics who went out in 1745, that wasn't entirely successful. It may have been part of the reason why more young gentlemen were perhaps sent away rather than educated in Scotland, but they'd obviously come back full of fervour and keen to go out for the Jacobites in the 45. So the Catholicism and Episcopalianism of the Northeast cannot be discounted as a really important factor as to why these men were prepared to go out and fight for the Jacobites. And crucially, I think a factor that is more heavily influential in the northeast of Scotland than it might be elsewhere. Right, so this current slide shows what we know of what happened to the officers at the end of the Rising. Now, you will notice that there appears to be some repetition, because it says escaped, and then it says escaped to Sweden and escaped to France. And that's simply because that's the data that we have. So for some people, we know exactly where they ended up, and for other people, all we know is that they did escape after the 45. So that's the reason for the repetition. However, it is worth having a look at it, because what you will see is that whilst there were obviously some deaths, as I've already mentioned, somebody had their throat cut, and pretty much all the Farquharsons died at Culloden, probably, and then other people died subsequently. The vast majority of these officers were either escaped and so ended up in Scandinavia or France, and um, for the most part, the split is religious. So Catholics went to France, and everyone else went elsewhere. Um, but it would be really interesting to perhaps have a look at what happened to officers from the Highlands and elsewhere, to see if that has the same sort of thing, because most of these people survived in some shape or form. There were in total, now you'll see quite a lot of people here, I think 17 escaped to Sweden. There were actually about 44 Scottish Jacobites who fled after Culloden and ended up in Sweden. The leader of the first tranche of refugees was David Lord Ogilvie. After Culloden, he and some of his men hid by Loch Worrell in Glenclava until about 3 weeks after Culloden, when they were able to get on a ship, James Weems, in Dundee. And so it's quite likely that most of those men ended up in Sweden. As I already mentioned, some William Aberdeen had his throat cut in Inverness as he lay ill in bed on the day of Culloden, which is pretty awful, really, isn't it? Thomas Blair of Glassoon escaped to Norway. He may then have gone to Sweden, and he certainly ended up in France later on. Um, the couple of people who were acquitted were both men in the Royal Ecossaise. Well, this doesn't tell the entire story, because there was also Charles Oliphant, who was a lieutenant, and he was convicted of high treason. He was then reprieved in February 1747, so a couple of months after he'd been convicted, and the year after he was transported to America. Um, James Crichton of Auchengool, who was the lieutenant colonel of the 2nd Battalion Lewis Gordons, escaped to France, where he died in 1768. We already mentioned him because he was a Catholic. So, George Abernethy of Banff, who was a captain in the Ogilvies and prior to that had been in Glenbuckets, he was sentenced to death and then reprieved, and then really sadly died of consumption in Southwark in April 1749. Although, quite interestingly, Sir John Cope appeared as a witness at his trial. As I already mentioned, I think it'd be really interesting to perhaps have a look at what the outcomes were for some of the Highland regiments, because what I wonder here, and I can't answer this without more research, so I'm going to leave this perhaps as a question at the end, is was the outcome better for these men because they served in lowland regiments and therefore were seen perhaps as more like the people who were sentencing them? They'd all be English speakers, even if they could speak Gaelic as well. They'd have all spoken English, and would that have led them to have a better outcome, perhaps, even the Catholic ones, than perhaps might have been the case elsewhere? Um, there is so much more to say about these people and to analyse, but I think half an hour is probably enough for a talk like this. So, thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you enjoyed it.